to the Newberry. I'm Daniel Green. I'm the president here at the Newberry Library. And welcome to Conversations at the Newberry, which is now in its 9th season. This series of conversations is an example of the Newberry Library's civic commitment to public education and to intellectual engagement, bringing together communities of scholars, students, and the public to discuss ideas that matter in our world today is central to the Newberry's mission. Newberry public programs are free and open to all. And the Newberry is able to host programs like Conversations at the Newberry free of charge because of the generous support from donors. There are many ways, too, that all of you can support the Newberry. You can visit our exhibitions and attend our public programs, as you're doing tonight. You can bring your friends and help spread the word about programs at the Newberry. You can follow the Newberry on any of our social media outlets. You can volunteer at the Newberry, and of course, you can make a donation to our annual fund. And Newberry staff here tonight will be happy to talk to you about any of these opportunities if you're interested. Tonight, we're here to explore the Midwest as place. And this event is part of our programming related to the Newberry's What is the Midwest project, which has been funded by a major grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. If you've not seen the What is the Midwest exhibition on view here, I'd encourage you to do that. The exhibition spans roughly 400 years from the 17th century to the 21st and tells a multitude of stories using Newberry collections, including maps, art, promotional ephemera, archival photos and videos, and personal letters and diaries. This exhibition challenges prevailing assumptions and persistent narratives about the Midwest, exploring the interactions between peoples and environmental conditions that have defined the region. Myths and stereotypes have informed American culture for generations, and ideas about the Midwest for generations. Insulated, homogeneous, flat, flyover country, real America. These ideas have power, and yet they all obscure important realities about the Midwest's past and present. And tonight we've brought together two distinguished historians with long commitments to writing about the Midwest to help us think deeply about this topic, Kristin Hoganson and Tim Guilfoyle. Kristin Hoganson is professor of history at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, specializing in the history of the United States in world context, cultures of US imperialism, and transnational history. She earned her PhD in history from Yale University and has written multiple books, including Consumers' Imperium, The Global Production of American Domesticity, 1865 to 1920, Fighting for American Manhood, How Gender Politics Provoked the Spanish-American and Philippine-American Wars, and American Empire at the Turn of the 20th Century. In her newest book, The Heartland, An American History, published by Penguin Press this year, Hoganson takes the concept of the American heartland as a starting point for understanding Midwestern politics and history. The heartland challenges the nostalgia so often at the center of portrayals of the Midwest. As she writes, the heartland myth insists that there is a stone-solid core at the center of the nation, local, insulated, exceptional, isolationist, and provincial, the America of America first, the home of Homeland Security, the defining essence of the center of the land. And then she explains in many ways, the Midwest is not so simple. She tells her readers that she was motivated to write this book after moving to Champaign in 1999. She had spent much of her life living on the East Coast in the Mid-Atlantic region and had heard all about the Heartland when she lived out there, but when she arrived, something didn't exactly fit. As she writes, the more I settled in, the less my environs seemed to fit my preconceptions. We'll all look forward tonight to hearing Kristin Hoganson reveal more about the gap between preconceptions and lived experience of the Midwest. And she'll be in conversation with Tim Guilfoyle, professor of history at Loyola University of Chicago, where he teaches American urban and social history. His research is focused on the development and evolution of 19th century urban underworld subcultures and informal economies, exemplified in part by his book, A Pickpocket's Tale, The Underworld of 19th Century New York, which was published by Norton in 2006. Tim has also explored urban cultures in his 1992 book, City of Eros, New York City, Prostitution and the Commercialization of Sex, 1790 to 1920. Tim Guilfoyle earned his PhD in history at Columbia University, and he's a good friend of the Newberry Library and has been since he held a National Endowment for the Humanities Lloyd Lewis Fellowship here during the 1990s. He remains a scholar in residence here at the Newberry today. Tim's interest in urban planning and public space led to a 2006 publication of Millennium Park, Creating a Chicago Landmark, which was published by the University of Chicago Press. Millennium Park is a beautifully illustrated book and an important contribution to understanding public culture in Chicago. At its opening in 2004, Millennium Park was hailed as one of the most important millennium projects in the world. Guilfoyle's book is a biography of this phenomenal undertaking, beginning before 1850, when the site of the park, the city's front yard, was part of Lake Michigan. In writing this book, Tim Guilfoyle studied the history of downtown, spent years with planners, artists, and public officials behind Millennium Park, documented it at every stage of its construction, and traced the financing through municipal government, global corporations, private foundations, and wealthy civic leaders. He tells a very compelling story of the transformation of a Midwest urban space from a rail yard that separated the city from the lakefront to a dynamic cultural and civic center. In doing so, he encourages readers to think about globalization in a Midwestern city, the historic legacy of political leadership and power, the influence of corporate philanthropy on the landscape, and the use of culture as a vehicle for economic expansion. And many of these themes, as you'll hear tonight, resonate deeply with Kristin Hoganson's work on the Heartland. Both Kristin Hoganson and Tim Guilfoyle are rooted in scholarship, yet they find ways to write engagingly for broad audiences. Their work takes on critical ideas in American history, identity, encounters between Europeans and indigenous peoples, environment, politics, and the contest over rights. In other words, both Hoganson and Guilfoyle have demonstrated that moving beyond myths and stereotypes about the Midwest gives us opportunities to think deeply about important ideas in American history, who we are as Americans, how identity is shaped, the relationship between the global and the local, and the contestations over borders and boundaries. We're so pleased to welcome Kristin Hoganson and Tim Guilfoyle to the Newberry tonight for this conversation on the Midwest as place. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you, Danny, for that warm introduction. I've been asked to do the first question, so I thought we might begin by talking a little bit about Danny's introduction, Kristin. Someone who grew up on the East Coast, lived in Connecticut, Boston, Washington, D.C., who's written on gender and diplomatic history. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the genesis of your interest in the Heartland and what led to the book.
So I want to thank Danny, too. It's just such a pleasure being here, and thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. So I think I'm interested in strange things, right? Things that are not what I expect them to be. That's how I've picked all the topics of things that I have written on in the past, that there's just something I encounter that I cannot explain, and it spikes my curiosity, and then I like to pursue things. So I think part of it was moving to Champaign from the East Coast and feeling like I had landed in a place I didn't really understand. And I knew that this would be my new home for some time to come, and I wanted to understand it. And then as I write about in the book, when I arrived in Champaign, I turned on the radio and I got the weather forecast for China and Argentina and Brazil. And for all of you who've been downstate and you know, it's because of commodity production, right, and the commodity markets, but I had not expected that. And then I think I started thinking about why I hadn't expected it, because I moved to Illinois in 1999, and the Berlin Wall had come down, and everybody in my fields was writing about globalization, right? The Cold War was over, and people were just focusing on the global 24/7. And I had been reading a lot of things on the Atlantic world, on global cities, on borderlands, on military bases, and all these places that were assumed to be global. And I realized that the rural Midwest was not part of those stories. And so I think it was that feeling of disjuncture, right, between what I had assumed was a globalized place and what the reality was in the community around me that got me going. So I was going to ask the same question of you, given that you have a background in writing about crime and vice, and then you ended up writing about Millennium Park, which I think is even stranger and begs some calls for some explanation.
I think the best way to answer that is to talk a little bit about New York. Contrary to what many Chicagoans may think, New York and Chicago have a great deal in common. They both started out as walking cities. They industrialized at the same time. They tended to attract immigrants from both Asia and Europe, oftentimes the same kinds of immigrants. They both have parks designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. They developed politics that were organized around political machines. Many of those ethnic groups that emerged organized their communities around neighborhoods, and the concept of neighborhood is very integral to both of those cities. And they both have really good pizza. So I think those themes made, the similarity of those themes, the overlap in those themes made it very easy for me to shift my interest from New York to Chicago. The two, in fact, when I first moved to Chicago in, I hate to say it, 30 years ago in 1989, seems like I just got here yesterday, I did a bike tour with my students that I had done in New York, and I was able to do it mainly by following the same themes and just changing the names of the different places that I encountered here in Chicago. So Kristen, I wonder if you could talk, we were talking about the Heartland here, the Midwest, how you first encountered the Midwest through Urbana-Champaign. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the borders after spending several years investigating the Heartland. Are there borders to the Midwest, or are there borders to the Heartland?
So I have heard that question so many times. Every time when I was working on the book, I would present my research. People would want to know, well, what's the Midwest, right? Which states count? What parts of the country should be included in the Midwest? And I was writing against that question. So one of the things that I wanted to tackle in the book was the idea of locality. And I wanted to think about ways of writing local history, because a lot of the local histories that I read in the early stages of the book were ones published in the 19th century. So they were very much written in a kind of antiquarian mode. And they were very much about boundary drawing, about saying that here's a set unit of geography, typically a county, but it could be a town. And the borders were assumed to be clear, and then the job of the local history was to fill in the space between the lines. And then with the filling in of the space between the lines, it meant looking inwards, only telling the stories of some people in the communities, and failing to track all the people who were pushed out forcibly, for example, in the case of Native Americans, or who left by choice. And those local histories failed to kind of stitch particular places into the wider fabric that constituted them. So in starting my research, having said I began with the weather report, I wanted to know those wider stories, right? I wanted to know how the specificities of a particular place fit into the larger tapestry of space, and that meant rethinking local history so that it isn't just a matter of looking in from set boundaries, but thinking about how locality or region is produced. And what I concluded is that it's produced through relationships, and that there is no one single set of relationships that determines place. So that to say that the Midwest is always bounded in a particular way is always an artificial way of looking at place. But if you think the Midwest is constituted by certain relationships, then you track each set of relationships, and then they reveal different maps. And then if you say the maps were done on transparencies, and then you layered them all, one on top of the other, then the series of maps that are produced would be the definition of place. So I don't want to talk too long, but let me just say one more thing just to give a couple examples. So one of the things I track is like beef production, right? And that's one set of maps that links Ontario to the Midwest to Nuevo Leon. And then if you look at pork production, that's another set of maps. And if you look at bioprospecting for things like soy, that's another set of maps. And if you look at immigration, another set of maps. If you look at Native American history, prior to colonization and subsequently, that's another set of maps. And I think if you pile them all on top of each other, that's the definition of place.
So,
yeah.
Well, just as a follow-up to that, one of the more fascinating parts of the book, for me at least, was how you were able to show that despite these various maps that you're describing, yeah, and the attachment to region or to place or to particular locale, your book really demonstrates how the Midwest is really, from the beginning, a global place, that much of the material production, whether it's slaughterhouses, whether it's steel, whether it's agricultural production of one sort or another, universities, are tied to global markets. Yet the persistence of the local identity is persistent. And even in politics, as you show, that the idea that the Midwest was always isolationist and provincial, you demonstrate with people like William B. McKinley and Dunlap that they were internationalists during the 1920s and the 1930s. So why is it that the notion of the Midwest as this kind of isolated region, provincial in many ways, has persisted so long when in fact it's been immersed in this kind of global economy?
Right. So that's about 5 questions, I think, embedded in your question. So let me just start by saying that one of the things I found was that so the book basically, it takes Champaign County as a starting point, and then it follows stories that lead out from downstate rural Illinois. In what is often considered a quintessentially local time, which is the 19th century. So it's after the early age of European colonialism, and it's before U.S. global power after World War I. And I argue that it's global before it becomes local, right? That the indigenous people who lived in central Illinois at the time of like the early pioneers had been displaced from the Detroit, Windsor, Ontario area. So that they were, over the course of time, geographically quite mobile, and then they were seasonally mobile, staying in villages to plant in the warmer months, and then traveling substantial distances, actually, in the winter to hunt and for diplomacy and to see the world. So locality was not a meaningful concept. And then the pioneers who came in, by definition, were people who came from someplace else. And so they have to invent locality, right? It's not, something that is inherent to their way of being in the world. They have to invent it. And in fact, for the Kickapoo people who bookend my book, their understanding of themselves is the people who move around. Like, that is fundamental to their group identity, is not being sedentary people. So then the question isn't only, about why ideas of locality have been so persistent, but like why they took off in the first place, right? And I think it's politics, so in part it's claiming space, claiming belonging, claiming ownership, lay at the base of, inventing ideas of locality. In terms of why the rural Midwest continues to be perceived, I think primarily by outsiders, is fundamentally local, I think also has to do with politics, right? Of the kind of flyover perspective of being able to look down on rubes and to, assume that one is superior to them, and that they have a more constrained, small-scale life than the flyers over, and that, I think, is a politically empowering sense, to be the person who looks down on the, ant-like people who you see below. It seems that in your work, you're actually dealing with very similar themes, right? In terms of thinking about the importance of globality and globalism. And one of the things that you argue in your book on Millennium Park is that it's fundamentally a global project, right? So you might, for those of you, I'm assuming everybody here who's been to the park, you might assume it's, a site-specific, area of land in Chicago, and it's, a fundamentally local place, but you argue, quite the contrary. So I wonder if you can explain what you mean by a global project and why it's so important to think of Millennium Park in that way.
Sure. Well, in many ways, the project, when it first began, was envisioned by one of the leading planners, John Bryan, who at the time was the CEO of Sara Lee and had been the chairman of the board of trustees at the Art Institute and University of Chicago and a number of other places. He had raised $100 million for the Lyric and the Symphony. And for a number of years, he had been trying to find a project that would define Chicago at the millennium, in part because he and many other corporate executives like him considered Chicago to be a global city, and they wanted to have a project that would advertise the city, that would promote the city, that would define the city as a global city. And when Richard Daley asked Brian to raise $30 million to build a park on top of the parking garage, what was the old Illinois Central Rail line, he jumped at the chance, walked out of the meeting, told his aide, we're not going to raise $30 million, we're going to raise 60 at least, and they ended up raising well over $230 million. And throughout the entire project, Brian wanted to recruit internationally reputable designers, architects, artists, as a way to advertise Chicago as a place of global culture, not just regional or local culture. And so you have a roster of very famous international artists. And Anish Kapoor, who's born in India, mother is Jewish, father is Hindu, lives on a kibbutz in Israel for a time, ends up in London, very much an international background himself. Jaume Plensa from Spain, even Frank Gehry, he's originally from Canada, Jewish background, migrates to Los Angeles. So the lineup of artists were international or global in Brian's mind. That was designed in part because he wanted to advertise Chicago as a global center. And finally, Richard Daley, who had to prove all this, genuinely believed that Chicago was no longer the city of big shoulders. It was a city that banned foie gras in the 1990s for a time, and that the economy had changed from industrial production to service and service-related enterprises, and it needed to develop institutions and a culture that would attract tourists, would attract service workers, would attract the creative class, as Richard Florida likes to refer to it, to Chicago. And so in that vein, Millennium Park from the beginning was a global project.
So one of the things that struck me about Millennium Park from reading your book is exactly what you were talking about, was the finding of talent elsewhere, right? On the part of city boosters, right? People, some of the major philanthropists who funded the park felt incredible gratitude for Chicago and wanted to give back. And yet they cast a global net, right, in looking for the talent to build the Pritzker Pavilion and the Cloud Gate, the bean sculpture, and so forth. And I don't know what you think about that, right? Like in terms of why go global for a Chicago monument, and what that means in the context of some urban critics talking about global cities all looking alike, right? That we're losing a sense of, site specificity or regional or distinctiveness in global cities. How kind of Millennium Park feeds into that?
Well, I think Chicago has always been both a regional city and a global city. If you think of immigration as a global phenomenon, for example, Chicago was a global city very, very early on. Fareed Zakaria, for example, has referred to immigration as the last frontier of globalization. I think he has it backwards. I think immigration is the first frontier. That's really what makes Chicago global, especially if we look at its population. It's always international for much of the 19th and 20th century. I think there's some truth that there is a kind of template, or what some people refer to as a trophy collection of structures that cities have adopted. They all have to have a domed stadium, a new arena, an art museum, an historic district, a convention center, and new high-rise hotels and apartment buildings in inner cities now to attract an upscale population, and most importantly, to tourists. Tourism is the biggest industry in the world now, and Richard Daley recognized that Chicago needed to no longer be flyover country. It needed to attract those tourists, and that was very much part of his motivation in following John Bryan's advice to attract an international roster of artists and designers. And so Daley saw it very much as an economic project as much as a cultural project. And perhaps the larger theme there is that culture is economic now, that culture has an economic benefit, and Millennium Park is in many ways the the representation of that. That Chicago, as I said before, is no longer the city of big shoulders. It relies upon these kinds of service-oriented economies and tourism, and for that reason, Brian was able to get a whole host of different families, the wealthiest, I guess you might say, the wealthiest families in Chicago, as well as some of the leading corporations, many of whom had genuinely believed that they owed Chicago something for doing so well for their families, particularly the Pritzkers, the Crowns, the Minnows, and they felt that this project was just the right project at just the right time.
So can I ask you just one more
Sure,
related
sure.
question to this? So what does this tell us about the kind of city Chicago is, right? Is it a Midwestern city, a global city? Can it be both? Like, what is the difference between those two things? And how, how does it fit into all these stereotypes we have about the Midwest, and thinking about, for coastal, types who might disdain it as flyover country? Is Chicago full of flyers over? Who are looking down on the hinterlands around it, or does Chicago really keenly feel the flyover, kind of slur and feel the deep connection, right, to being a city located in the Midwest?
I think it depends on who you ask in Chicago. Yeah. I think in many ways, as I said before, Chicago is both a regional and Midwestern city as well as a global city. It's you can be all those things, I think, at one time. And I think the corporate elite, middle classes in Chicago generally have more in common with the cultures of New York and San Francisco, that they're part of an urban network, and the kinds of cultural institutions overlap, whether it's professional sports, museums. They have very similar economies. And I think there's more of an urban-rural divide than there is a divide, a regional divide in that respect. I think Chicago has more in common with other cities than it does with the rural portions of the Midwest. And so in some ways, that's where I find the mythology of the Midwest to be confusing, because it seems that people have more of an attachment to cities now than they do necessarily to the surrounding region, even though they in fact may be dependent on them in many ways. Maybe they even migrated from those surrounding regions. So how do you feel about Chicago? Is Chicago a part of the Midwest in your mind, based on the way you've thought about the Heartland and defined the Heartland as you just described?
So those are two different questions. So one is a part of the Midwest, and I would say it's a hub city in the Midwest. The other question is a part of the Heartland, and that's a very different question, right? Because I think the Heartland is a political word that has a lot of connotations that the Midwest does not have. So for those of you who don't follow these things, the word Heartland was not attached to the Midwest until after World War II. And it drew on European geostrategic thinking. That's the origins of the word. So there was a British geographer who was writing against the navalist theories of the late 19th century, which held that whoever dominates the oceans of the world will dominate the world. And Sir Halford Mackinder said, actually, it's whoever dominates the land masses will become the global superpower. And then during World War II, as the war was unfolding in Europe, the word Heartland started surfacing a lot in US newspapers, right? It was the struggle for the control of the Heartland. And then after World War II, as the Cold War got going, then the word continued to be, circulated in US newspapers because it was the same thing. Who would dominate the Eurasian Heartland? The assumption being whoever dominated the Heartland would dominate the world. And so it was in that context that the word Heartland then was adopted in the United States. And initially it was the industrial Heartland, right? And then it was understood as the seat of power, right? The Great Lakes region, all the industry around it was understood as the US industrial Heartland from which US power will emanate to the far reaches of the world. And I would say Chicago is very much part of that Heartland, right? Is a seat, of finance, of commodities tradings, of insurance, and related industries. But then I think as the Cold War started to, weigh on people more, and in the aftermath of the horrors of World War II, and just imagining what the next war would look like, in the context of intercontinental, ballistic missiles, long-range bombers, nuclear weapons, the sense of like annihilation is potentially imminent, right? That we're living in a very dangerous time, and nobody is safe. I think it was in that political context that people started to latch on to different ideas about the heartland, ideas of the family farm, right? Of the silo, of the picket fence, of the homogenous white America in a time in which urban areas are diverse, right? As they always have been, but with the Great Migration, diverse in new ways in northern cities. And I think there was a kind of retreat from the celebration of the industrial heartland and usages of that word towards focusing on the soft focus heartland, right? The heartland of more nostalgia and boundary drawing, the kind of national safe space heartland that got pinned to ideas of like provincialism, insularity, isolationism, and I don't think Chicago is part of that heartland. Yeah.
So do you think, what you've described in a sense is a myth, that much of the perception about the heartland is grounded on nostalgia and on ideas that in some ways are less grounded in history. And I'm wondering, given how much of the Midwest is deindustrialized, how much of the focus, the foundation for the conception of the heartland was based on industry, doesn't exist anymore. How do we, does that change the conception of how Americans think about the heartland in a world of the internet and cyberspace? I guess this gets to the question that sometimes urbanists ask, that do cities need to exist anymore when you have the internet, when everybody can communicate in cyberspace? Does place really matter anymore? Is that relevant to what you're thinking about the heartland? That's sort of a spontaneous question, I apologize.
I'm trying to process that, right? I think you might want to answer your own question, Do you want to have first crack at that?
Well, I think place still does matter, that even though it's just changed the way places intersect with each other. 20 years ago, urbanists were debating this very question. Will cities, like retail, retail's going through a difficult time right now because people buy everything online. And so you have lots of empty spaces. Walk down any street here in Chicago, and there's lots of empty storefronts. And that's true in every community in the country. Is that the wave of the future? I don't think so. I think people still want to have that kind of personal contact. And in fact, urbanists like Saskia Sassen argue that it's these small, low-level contacts that really make cities global. It's not just having corporate headquarters, but it's also having smaller units of interaction among various firms. In some ways, Chicago is an excellent example of that, because Chicago has one of the highest populations of high-tech workers, one of the highest densities of high-tech workers. It's largely hidden. In the last 10 years, Chicago added 137,000 tech jobs in the city. That's 2.5 Amazons. 2.5 Amazons. We didn't even have to offer any subsidies for it. And it's those workers that are filling all the high-rises, the South Loop, 9 Walton, just down the street here where all the rich people live, like Jonathan Tays and others. So I think place still does matter, but it has been reconfigured in ways that as we're living through, we don't fully understand.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've been thinking about is how history connects to our understandings of place and our appreciation of place and the meanings we attach to place. I think a lot of people feel their proximate communities very keenly, because they're in face-to-face contact with people. They have certain kind of geographic routines and understand their position in the world because of their kind of spatial experiences. And so I think that understanding, the spaces around us adds meaning to our daily lives in ways that, as a historian, slicing things deep chronologically can do as well, right? Which is one of the reasons why I enjoyed your Millennium Park book so much, because it helped me understand a space that I had gone through without fully understanding the backstory, right? The making of the sausage. And now every time, and in fact,
Chicago metaphor,
right? And so when I got off the bus, I went there first thing today, just to look at it with new eyes, and I feel like my experience walking through the park and seeing the Cloud Gate, was greatly enriched by knowing the backstory. Now I'm wandering and I'm losing my train of thought. Oh, I know. So the train of thought has to do with how in the creation of the park, there was so much emphasis placed on the arts, right? And you make this very powerful argument for how global cities really need to have tourist attractions and public parks as major global city tourist attractions, just how fundamental that is to the economies of major cities and drawing people, out of the countryside where they can, they could look at coneflowers if they hadn't all been turned into corn and soy, into the city to look at coneflowers right in the garden. And so how important having the sculpture and the performing arts was to that vision of creating a meaningful space for Chicago. And it made me think about what role does history play in the production of public space, right? And the meanings that people attach to public space by having, kind of a deeper understanding of the production of that place through time. And I don't know if you want to comment on that, for Millennium Park in particular, but also just more generally in terms of thinking about Chicago.
Well, I think that relates back to my earlier comments about Chicago and people like Richard Daley and John Bryan and others seeing Chicago as a global city and wanting to compete as a global city. From 1834 to roughly the 1950s, Chicago's main competitors was New York and other cities in the Midwest, and that world doesn't exist anymore. Chicago's competition is places like Shanghai and Glasgow and other global cities, and all those cities are creating their own kinds of cultural institutions to create, to bring in, to attract tourists, to be part of that tourist economy. And if you don't develop those kinds of institutions and use art and culture to attract tourists, you're going to decline as an urban center. And Chicago's not alone in doing this. You can think of, I think perhaps the two big examples, the one that's often given is Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain. How many people here ever heard of Bilbao, Spain before 1997? No one did. Okay. Very few of us did. Yet now it attracts well over 1 million, maybe 2 million tourists a year. It's $1 billion in tourist revenue. It's become a kind of a model. And in many ways, the one that really predates that was Sydney's Opera House, which nobody ever went to Sydney for the most part before the 1960s. And that was a project much like Millennium Park. It was 12 years overdue, 10 times the expense from what they originally contracted for. Yet today it is the most widely attended and widely used performing arts facility in the world in terms of the number of people that go through and the number of productions that take place there. And for many, it's the only reason to go to Sydney. And that, I think, is emblematic of the kind of global urban world that we live in at the moment, and that cities have to find creative ways to attract tourists. The turn of the 20th century, they could rely on industry, and industry came to Chicago, and industry attracted immigrants. And that world just doesn't exist anymore. And so people like Richard Daley believed that they needed to find a way to address the way the global economy was changing.
So let me ask a follow-up question. So you talk in the book, you give the designers credit for their historical awareness, right? With the Paris style and the kind of evocation of the architectural past of that space and the architectural, past of Chicago. and you credit them for not just producing, amusement park kinds of mythologies in the public space produced in the park, but I wonder if they are producing some mythologies implicitly, right, by virtue of what is not being kind of foregrounded in the park, right? So I'm thinking about histories, given my interest of like settler colonialism, right, and how that's effaced, right, that longer, history of that place in the, kind of contemporary, physical layout and sculpture and so forth in the park. I'm thinking about like histories of race in Chicago, right? Like, does Millennium Park grapple with that, or public spaces in Chicago grapple with that adequately? And then I'm also thinking about, like, Millennium Park is about the millennium, right? It's the shiny, bright future, and it's posed as an urban future, right? That the future is in downtown Chicago. That's where we're supposed to look for, what lies on the horizon for the new millennium. And is that producing another set of myths, right? Like, you're not going to look for the millennium in Champaign-Urbana, USA, much less in Rantoul or Sydney or Tolono, or places that, those of you who haven't been downstate have never heard of, right? Is it perpetuating certain mythologies about where the future can be found?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're onto something there, that it does create its own sense of mythology, even though they are evoking history. It doesn't commemorate the race riot of 1919 or contract lending in Chicago and some of the more racially divisive histories in Chicago. In some sense, it does relate to, reflect even, the divided city that we live in today, with the wealthier North Side and the Loop area and the more impoverished South Side and West Side neighborhoods. But I guess in defense of Millennium Park, I would use my Barack Obama answer, in that the park is designed to try and find areas of commonality, of shared heritage, shared values, and try and create a space where large numbers of diverse people can come together. And if you go to the Jazz Festival or the Blues Festival, or watch children in the Crown Fountain during the summer, you'll find a highly integrated, mixed audience. Tim Black, the well-known African-American historian and civil rights activist who marched with Martin Luther King, has even said that Millennium Park is the most diverse, integrative space in Chicago today. Is it perfect? No. But I think in terms of what was its original intentions were, in terms of trying to find a space to bring people together, to attract residents of diverse backgrounds, as well as foreigners and tourists, create an international audience. In that sense, I think it's succeeded better than what the original planners thought it would. Do you have another one?
I could ask more.
Okay,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Just looping back to where I began, what was the most surprising thing you found when you started doing Chicago history? Everybody keeping in mind that he came to the topic from vice and crime.
I didn't find any prostitute, pickpockets, or pornographers in any of my research. So, no comment. So I think there's two surprises that I had. The first was, and this appears again and again in some of the research I do on Chicago, is how integrated, or how Chicago's elite were so devoted to Chicago that any kind of political divisions based on origin, divisions based on politics, were often overcome by their profound devotion to Chicago. Many of the divisions that we associate with our political climate today just don't exist among many of the Chicago elite. And so Republicans, I'm blanking on the name now, but we're willing to work with Democrats in regards to raising money for Millennium Park. The other theme that Pat Ryan is the person I was thinking of, the founder of Aon, got along famously well with John Bryan or Newt Minow, who are devout Democrats, and that kind of singular sense of trying to boost Chicago or promote Chicago was different than what you find in New York or Los Angeles, where the elites are very divided. New York because they're spread out among 3 different states, and LA because they're just spread out across the Southern California region. You just didn't have that kind of division I found in Chicago. The other difference was that everything led to the mayor. No matter what happened, no matter what conflict you may have had with the mayor, you could not break any kind of tie you had with the mayor, that ultimately all decisions, not just for Millennium Park, but anything related to much of the city's economy, its philanthropy, often went back to the mayor. Even though the city technically has a weak mayor system. You would never guess it by looking at Richard Daley. So did you have a particular surprise about the Heartland that you didn't expect when you began the book?
I did not know I would write a lot of material on birds. Yeah, so, I grew up in the suburbs, right, of Washington, D.C., and I had no idea how important birds were to rural people, especially in the 19th century for things like protein, and it was not just like ducks and geese, but in the 19th century, people were hunting a lot of birds that are on the endangered species list now. And they paid a lot of attention when bird populations started plummeting. And I also didn't expect to find that prior to synthetic pesticides, people were relying on birds for insect pest control. And that behind the formation of groups like the Audubon Society, there were a lot of farm communities and farmers who wanted to protect birds for food security reasons, right? Thinking that what is going to get rid of the insect pests that are decimating the cherries in your tree. If we don't have birds, then the crops will fail. We'll have plagues of grasshoppers and locusts. And I had not expected to find that people in small rural communities were early constituencies for figuring out migration routes, right? So that they're looking at hemispheric maps to try to figure out, when the populations start plummeting, well, is it just because of their hunting? Is it just because they're destroying the habitat by tiling and draining, the fields and doing, commercialized agriculture? Or what is happening in the other destinations? And so they were avid, audiences and participants in the efforts to try to band and figure out where birds went. So I certainly had not expected that at all. And I also hadn't expected, when I started researching into the history of the Kickapoo people, 19th century maps that stretch from traveling performers in Britain that probably had Kickapoo members, in these traveling performing groups. And then in terms of looking at place names that turned up in various searches into Kickapoo history, geographies in the 19th century stretching again from the Detroit-Windsor area to Mackinac, to upstate New York, to Washington, D.C., to Florida Territory, to Texas, to Coahuila, Mexico, to Mexico City, to Cuernavaca, even farther south, and as far west as Sonora. I did not know that these were 19th century geographies of a people who were assumed to be just East Central Illinois people. And I don't think they were unique in that respect. And I hadn't expected to find histories of exiled Native Americans trying to get the right to return to the United States, that was something else that I found to be quite moving. Yeah, but we're getting signals that it's time for questions.
I'll bring the microphone to you. So does anyone have a question and kick us off? Okay.
Hello, I'm from a farm in Iowa and particularly interested in this topic, and then I was surprised by the cover artwork on the program, and was interested in how it perpetuated stereotypes and ideas around what the rural is, where the rural is, what the Midwest is. We see a giant cornstalk, a happy cow trotting around, an empty field, and the city far, far in the distance. And so I was curious, how writing and thinking and archiving the Midwest and the rural as both an outsider and insider affects the type of writing and thinking you do as historians.
So let me go first. And in part I want to respond to you, but in part I want to respond to something you asked about, which is why have stereotypes and myths lasted so long, right? And I think part of that is about self-representation, and part of it is about the relative neglect of Midwestern studies and Midwestern history. And so part of that has to do with the assumption that Midwestern history is in some way like national history or doesn't deserve, its own group. So this is something that John Locke has written about, where how the Middle West History Review is now the flagship journal of the Organization of American Historians. So it no longer exists as a regional journal, right? And was part of a movement away from thinking about Midwestern regionalism, even in a time when there was more attention to the Northeast, to the Southeast, and to the Trans-Mississippi West, and the Midwest just kind of got left behind as a nationally and globally recognized area of interest. And so I think in terms of us trying to grasp why stereotypes and myths have lasted so long about places like this mythical, farm with no suburbs or anything, and just bingo, the city in the background. Part of it is, just wanting to come up with a catchy design, but part of it might, connect to longer histories of assuming that the Midwest was not really particularly very interesting or worthy of much study. And I'm really happy to say I think we're in a moment of growing interest. And it's ironic, right? Because we're living in a self-consciously global age. So then why focus so much attention on region? But I think the two things are complementary in various ways. And we are looking, I think, at a kind of a renaissance in interest in the Midwest with like the Midwest History Association and various like college, programs. The Newberry has been doing more. Which I'm very, very appreciative of trying, to focus more on Chicago history and to think about Chicago in its surrounding area. And I think if, Chicago doesn't do it, who's going to do it, right? Like, I think Midwesterners have to feel like we matter, right? And that we don't have to kind of cede historical analysis to the rest of the country. And I think through self-representation and people from who are living in or have familiarity with the communities we're writing about are maybe more likely to write nuanced histories and not just to reproduce myths. And I have to say, in working with the commercial press for my first time, with the book that just came out, there was a lot of pushback, right? Like the kind of editorial pressure to reproduce the myths. I'm like, no, I'm writing against these, right? But this is what's true, is the kind of the word from New York. Like, how can you be going against what we all know is true, that you're all yokels out there on the, I'm on TV. Oh my gosh, I so apologize to this was a previous editor who left the press, I have to say. Not with the editor I'm working with now. But I think there were these outside perceptions, right, of what the story would be like that I felt like I could push back against, by virtue of research, but also by virtue of living in the place that I was writing about.
Yeah, I would just like to follow up to support Kristin here. And one of the strengths of the Heartland, the book, as well as the Heartland, I guess, is that she demonstrates that the Heartland is a global place, that it is highly sophisticated, that it's filled with universities located in rural areas, farmers that are engaged in scientific agriculture, you're one of them, and that the idea of it being a kind of a Yahoo backwards place is really is part of the myth. It really is the myth, and I think that's one of the strengths of the book, is that you're able to demonstrate that kind of global sophistication, if you want to use that.
And I
word.
also have to say I'm arguing against Chicago too, right? Against the idea that Chicago is the center and everything around it is the hinterland of Chicago. And in fact, if you look at it from different angles, there are a lot of networks and connections that don't thread through Chicago as the major place, right? The railroads might connect in Chicago, but if you're looking at something like scientific agriculture, then it's not all about Chicago is the center. It's about people in rural communities networking with each other on their own. And I think that's a pushing back against urban biases, not just like regional biases, to reach those kinds of conclusions.
I think, did you have a question?
So I'd like to know, you never really addressed what your parameter was to describe the Midwest. Where does it belong? I mean, where does it exist? What are the boundaries?
It exists everywhere. Yeah, that's what makes it so interesting,
In
right?
Los Angeles?
So there are, in the 19th century, people who leave the community, I take as my starting point, who go look for gold in California in the gold rush, and some of them come back, right? There are people who go look for gold in Pikes Peak, and some of them come back. And one of the things, so I talk about like settler colonists, like people who took land from Native Americans, and their children took land from Native Americans further west, and their grandchildren took land from Native Americans further west. So we were just walking through the exhibit that I hope all of you have a chance to see on the Midwest. That's as you enter the building, it's to the left. And there's a really fascinating book in there by a Nebraska railroad that identifies where the people who are buying land in Nebraska along the railroad tracks come from. And many of them come from other places in Nebraska, but they also come from Illinois, as well as from Germany and places in Europe. And this is part of a pattern, right, of people who would put down roots in one place. The land becomes more expensive. They have lots of children, and they have family ties that go as far as places like Los Angeles. They're bioprospecting for things like soy in East Asia. They are investing in genetic material for pig production that comes via the ships of the British Empire from places like China, which gave Midwestern farmers a 7,000-year shortcut in breeding swine with longer intestines, which would enable them to make more meat out of each unit of food, because there was like 7,000 years in which European pigs were separate from Chinese pigs. So that's very much a Midwestern story. Then the pork products they produce feed the British Empire, right? So they go to, for South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and so forth. And then I'll shut up after this one more comment, is also, if you think about like how Chicago has been conceived, or the Midwest has been conceived, it's the Midwest, right? It's between the East and the far West, which assumes this kind of national mapping. It's the only places that matter are US places, and the Midwest is somehow in the middle of that. But if you tilt the axis, and you look north-south, then there are all these hemispheric connections, which include like the figuring out the bird migrations. They include many, many connections across the northern border with Canada. And then likewise, if you think about, again, with the exhibit, there's some really great material on the Illinois Central Railroad, which ran from Chicago downstate in the 1850s. Its southern terminus is New Orleans, which makes it the railroad. That's the imperial railroad for when the Panama Canal is constructed, right? Then it's the Illinois Central. It's investing in things like shipping facilities in Cuba so it can dominate the Caribbean basin. And then through the Panama Canal, it's the hub to the Pacific, a major hub to the Pacific. And that trade then gets brought back up in the Illinois to places like Chicago. So the Illinois Central becomes a leading carrier of things like coconuts and bananas. So again, these are mappings that involve not only Chicago, but other places in the area that are, if you follow the different relationships, are global mappings, even in the mid and late 19th century.
We have time for one more question.
Hello. I just think of Chicago being the Midwest, and I think of birth and rebirth. And I just jotted down just one word, in many different sections of a piece of paper. And I think of neighborhoods. You had International Harvester, Western Electric, U.S. Steel, Chicago Tribune. The attitude of roll up your sleeves and put it on the stage, with our entertainment industry. Our international geography. We have European population. The University of Chicago, the birth of nuclear activity, Latin American, Polish, German, Chinatown, industry just in general. Chicago makes your head swim. The Park District, Olmsted, the creation and designs of the parks. grammar schools, the stock market, the rural stockyards, architecture and engineering, the railroad system, the mail order houses developed, you know, how many years ago with Sears, building trades growth, holy mackerel, you know, it's just amazing how much Chicago is contributing to our society and has been contributing for the last 100 years. It's exceptional.
I agree.
On that note, thank you to you both.